The electric bill was $612.47. Lester Boone set it on the counter next to the phone and did not open it for 2 days. He knew what was in it. The REA meter reader had come out on a Thursday in early August, same as always, and Lester had watched him write the number on his clipboard from across the yard. He had done the arithmetic in his head before the man's truck reached the end of the drive. The irrigation pump had been running since the last week of May. The drought that came to southwestern Nebraska in the summer of 1984 did not arrive like a storm. It arrived the way most agricultural disasters arrive, gradually, then undeniably. May had been dry. June had been drier. By the first week of July, the soil moisture readings at the Extension office in McCook were showing subsoil deficits that the agronomist there described, in the careful language of someone who had seen this before, as severe. The summer of 1984 was part of a broader pattern that had been building across the Central Plains for 2 years. The Palmer Drought Severity Index, the measure agricultural lenders and insurance adjusters used to quantify what farmers already knew from walking their fields, had been running negative across much of Nebraska since late 1982. Not catastrophically negative in most years. Negative enough to draw down the subsoil moisture reserves that carry a crop through a dry stretch in July. Negative enough that when the summer of 1984 turned genuinely hot and dry, there was nothing stored in the ground to compensate. For dryland farmers, the 1984 drought was a yield loss they absorbed and wrote down. For irrigated operations, it was a different equation. The water was available. The equipment to apply it was in the field. The decision to run the pivot was not difficult. The corn needed water, and Lester had the means to provide it. What he had not fully calculated in late May, when he started the pump for the first time, was what the electrical load would look like across 78 consecutive days of operation. Lester farmed 320 acres northeast of Indianola, split between corn and winter wheat. The corn was on a center pivot irrigation system he had installed in 1979, financed over 10 years, still carrying $34,000 in principal. The wheat was dry land. In a normal year, the pivot ran perhaps 6 weeks between June and August, pulling from an irrigation well that had never given him trouble in the 22 years since his father had drilled it. In 1984, the pivot ran from May 28th through August 14th, 78 days. At the pump's rated draw of 47 kilowatt-hours per hour of operation, running an average of 14 hours a day across 78 days, the electrical load came to approximately 51,000 kilowatt-hours. At the rural cooperative's rate of 0.068 per kilowatt-hour, which had itself increased 11% from the prior year following the cooperative's fuel adjustment filing in January. The bill came to $612.47. In May of 1983, the same pump had generated a bill of $287. The difference was not entirely the drought. Some of it was the rate increase. Some of it was that Lester had run the pump harder and longer than he ever had, because the alternative was watching the corn fail in a year when he could not afford for the corn to fail. He opened the bill on Saturday morning. He set it on the counter and looked at it the way you look at something you have already decided not to flinch at, and found that he flinched anyway. $612.47. The seed dealer's invoice was due September 15th. He had ordered the seed in February when the price was locked and the planting intentions were filed, and everything about 1984 still looked like a recoverable year. The invoice was for $1,840, corn seed and wheat seed for the fall planting, plus the pre-emergent herbicide he applied every spring on the corn ground. He had $1,190 in the operating account. He could pay the electric bill and have $577 left. Not enough for the seed invoice. He could pay the seed invoice and have nothing left. The electric bill would go unpaid. He could pay neither and wait to see what the corn brought at harvest, which was 6 weeks away, and hope the elevator price held, and the yield was what the pivot had bought him. He sat at the table with the two invoices side by side and worked through the consequences of each option on a notepad. Not because he was uncertain about the arithmetic. The arithmetic was not complicated. He was working through the sequence. Which unpaid obligation created the most downstream risk? An unpaid seed invoice to a dealer he had done business with for 11 years had a specific set of consequences. A late fee of 1.5% per month, a strained relationship with a man whose goodwill Lester would need the following February when he placed the next year's order, and the forfeiture of the 2% early payment discount that represented $36.80 in real money. An unpaid electric bill to the rural cooperative had a different set of consequences, the most significant of which was disconnection, which, if it occurred before harvest and before the pivot had finished its last application cycle, would mean the pump stopped running. That risk was already behind him. The pivot had shut down August 14th. The crop was set. The pump did not need to run again until next May. The electric bill could wait in a way the seed invoice could not. That was the conclusion the notepad reached. And this is the part people outside of farming don't always understand. It wasn't that Lester was broke. The money was right there, sitting in that field, 6 weeks from harvest. But a bill due in August don't wait for an October harvest. That's not a money problem. That's a timing problem. The crop was good. The yield was there. The calendar just didn't line up, and the bill didn't care. Lester was not in financial crisis in the way that word was being used in Nebraska in 1984. He was not facing foreclosure. His land payment was current. His equipment notes were being serviced. What he had was a cash flow problem, a specific, bounded problem that existed because 3 bills had converged in the same 60-day window, and his operating account did not have room for all 3. This was a different problem than not having enough money. It was a problem of sequence, of which obligation moved first and which one waited. He called the REA office on Monday. The woman who handled billing accounts knew him by name. He had been a customer for 24 years. He explained the situation without drama. The drought, the pump hours, the 2 invoices, the timing problem. He was not asking her to forgive the bill or reduce it. He was asking whether there was a mechanism that would allow him to pay it after harvest without penalty. She put him on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said the cooperative had a 30-day extension provision for agricultural accounts during documented drought conditions. The provision was not advertised. It was in the cooperative's bylaws, written in 1962 by a board that had itself farmed through dry years and understood that a cash flow problem in August was not the same as an inability to pay. She said the 1984 drought had been declared an agricultural disaster by the state in June. She said if he could confirm his operation was within the declared area, she could apply the extension without a formal written application. He said his farm was in Red Willow County. She said that was within the declaration. She said the new due date would be October 15th. She said interest would not accrue on the balance during the extension period. She said she was noting the account. The call lasted 9 minutes. Lester thanked her and hung up and sat for a moment with the phone still in his hand. He had expected the call to be more difficult. He had prepared a longer explanation. He had not needed it. What the extension did was not complicated. It moved a due date by 30 days. It did not reduce the bill. It did not improve the corn price. It did not change the underlying arithmetic of a farm year in which input costs had run higher than planned, and revenue was still 6 weeks from arriving. What it did was break the sequence problem. 9 minutes. That's all it took. But that same week, somewhere out there was probably another farmer with the exact same bill and the exact same problem who never made that call. Maybe nobody told him that option even existed. Maybe he didn't want to look like he couldn't handle his own business. Maybe he just figured they'd say no before he even asked. That's not weakness. That's just not knowing what you don't know. And during the farm crisis, there were a lot of people in that position. Nebraska in the fall of 1984 was a state in the middle of something that did not yet have a clean name, but that everyone who farmed there could feel. The farm debt crisis, which would later be documented in congressional hearings and academic papers, and the particular journalism that emerges when a way of life is visibly ending, was in its third year of acceleration. Land values that had peaked in 1981 had been falling for 3 years. The operating loans that farmers had taken on the assumption of stable land values were being called by lenders who were themselves under pressure from regulators who had decided that agricultural lending had gotten ahead of the underlying collateral. In Red Willow County, the Farm Home Administration Office had processed more loan restructuring requests in 1984 than in the previous 5 years combined. The word foreclosure appeared in the local paper with a frequency that made it ordinary, a listing in a column near the back, 5 or 6 names some weeks, more in the spring. Lester was not in that column. He was in the quieter category of farmer who was managing, not comfortably, not with margin to spare, but managing. The distinction mattered. Managing meant the next decision was still available. It meant the options had not collapsed to one. With the electric bill deferred to October 15th, Lester paid the seed invoice on September 12th, 3 days early, which preserved his early payment discount of 2%. The discount came to $36.80. Small. The kind of small that, in a good year, you do not think about, and in a year like 1984, you notice and count. Corn harvest began the last week of September. His yield came in at 94 bushels per acre on 160 acres of irrigated ground, below his 5-year average of 118, but not a failure. The pivot had done what he had run it to do. The crop was below expectation and above the threshold where the numbers still worked. The dry land wheat on the remaining 160 acres had not fared as well. Planted the previous fall, it had come through the dry summer on whatever moisture the subsoil had held, and the yield had been thin, 28 bushels per acre against a normal 42. But wheat was a secondary crop on this operation, and he had not irrigated it, and had not expected to. The loss was real, and it was already absorbed into the year's accounting before harvest began. At the elevator in Indianola, corn was paying $2.38 per bushel that October. 160 acres at 94 bushels at $2.38 came to $35,814. He deposited the first check on October 3rd. He paid the electric bill on October 9th, 73 days after he had set it on the counter without opening it. Red Willow County recorded 34 farm foreclosure filings in calendar year 1984. Lester Boone's farm was not among them. Not because he had found a better price or a larger yield or a lender willing to restructure his debt. His debt structure had not changed. His price had been the same as every other farmer who sold corn in McCook that October. What he had done was make one phone call on a Monday morning and ask a woman he had known for 24 years to look up a policy he did not know existed. The farm survived 1984 the way most farms that survived 1984 survived it. Not through a single dramatic decision, but through a sequence of small ones, each of which kept the next option available. The electric bill sat on the counter for 73 days. The farm is still there, still